I've been working on blockchain and thinking about the legal ramifications to start with, but my sort of research has very much evolved since then for about somewhere between 4 and 5 years now. So I've seen it come into much more into mainstream discourse. And when I think the first presentation I ever gave on blockchain was at Bristol Law School, and it was actually to a room of economists. And at that point, I thought it would be interesting to do a sort of a straw poll and find out how many people knew what blockchain was. So I'm going to do the same thing here, actually. So by a show of hands, who has heard of blockchain? You see, if they're going back, even a couple of years, that would have been 50% of that, if not less. The great follow-up question that I used to have then was, well, if you haven't heard of blockchain, who's heard of Bitcoin? So again, who's heard of Bitcoin? Far more people, not least for the fact that it's been a very newsworthy story of late. A question I haven't been able to ask necessarily previously, and I'm going to ask now, is how many people are working with blockchain or cryptocurrencies in some form?
Working with
or you've gone past it. I'm done with it. Yeah, it's rubbish. So that's an interesting one. So still not many people. So we are still really, and this comes to a crucial element of the work that I do, and I mentioned it earlier, that I'm interested in the way that blockchain is spoken about, the way that it's presented, the way that it's received and reproduced by this blockchain ecosystem. So I suppose what I'm interested in are a series of meta-analyses that exist around blockchain as a technology. So I speak about blockchain as a technology, but I speak more interestingly, the points that are raised are those of how it is reproduced in different systems, whether that's economics, law, culture, and so on and so forth. So it's a very short video, and I'm just going to very quickly show you this video. Now, as I say, a few years ago, this would have been a very important device for me in presenting, because lots of people simply didn't know what blockchain was or hadn't heard of it. Now, far more of you have. And anyone who goes onto YouTube or onto the internet, onto the web generally, you will be absolutely bombarded by news stories and videos telling you what blockchain is. So, as I said, I will show you this video. It's very short, but the point being is that it will explain, maybe clear up some of the finer detail of what blockchain actually is for those of you who are perhaps a little bit vague on some of the details. But more importantly, I'm interested in actually the way that this is reproducing the idea of blockchain and giving it back to you. So this isn't my video. This is one that's produced by CNET and is widely available. I think it's been watched about 18,000 times on YouTube, which these days is absolutely nothing, but nonetheless, there are others out there that have done far more.
What is blockchain? Blockchain is a network of computers that polices itself, so people or businesses can cooperate without fear that somebody is tampering with the data. Today, most data is sealed up at a central organization like a bank or the Department of Motor Vehicles. Blockchain moves that information to a decentralized, shared network of computers, maybe even thousands of them, to create an open, transparent, immutable database. That data could include everything from sales transactions to medical records. It's called a blockchain because computers periodically collect transactions into groups called blocks. Each block gets a digital fingerprint called a hash, and each new block's hash is cryptographically linked to the previous block's hash, basically forming an unbreakable chain. Any tampering with a transaction is easily detected and rejected because it messes up the hash not only of the block it's in, but also every other block added afterward. If a tampered block is on your computer, the rest of the blockchain network just ignores it. In the future, for instance, there may be a blockchain network for concert ticket sales. You want to buy a ticket from a stranger, somebody you might not trust in the real world. The blockchain takes care of confirming that the original owner is legitimate, hasn't sold the ticket already, and that you're the new owner. Then the network locks the data. Many companies are investing in blockchain, and many more are investigating it. Walmart is testing blockchain so it can quickly pull contaminated food from store shelves. And De Beers is tracking diamonds so you can be sure those anniversary earrings didn't fund somebody's war. You might not notice blockchain as it makes businesses run more smoothly, but more directly, it should bring you peace of mind.
Right, so as I say, that's one example of a video which explains blockchain. And I mean, to my mind, it explains it in a fairly useful way. And it's, I guess, again, it's symptomatic of the evolution of blockchain in public thinking, that it's been able to kind of get beyond just simple discussion of what Bitcoin is and what cryptocurrencies are. And that's really, I mean, my interest in this really lies in what the technology is doing in these sort of post-cryptocurrency or use cases and concepts, of which there are any number, and it would be almost impossible really to do justice to the detail of it here today. So I'm going to try and stick with this theme, really, of dealing with blockchain as a cultural product, if you like, or as something which is being mobilized by different parties in different ways and for different reasons. Now, I find this is you find this as an epigraph actually at the beginning of the Tapscott's book. Now, anyone who hasn't seen Don and, now I can't remember what his son's called, but they are a father and son team who have been sort of technology entrepreneurs for a long period of time, and they got into Bitcoin and blockchain fairly early on and became influential spokespeople about this particular technology. They're not the Winklevoss brothers, who have sort of more famously just made an absolute, billions of dollars, quite frankly, in their trading of Bitcoin. These guys are doing something slightly different, but more importantly, they've written this influential book on blockchain revolution, which tries to deal with a number of the different sort of features of blockchain that get beyond cryptocurrency. Now, there are any number of sort of titles that are on the market now that deal with blockchain and Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. And they tend to reside in this sort of realm of a manual, of trying to sort of present the technology in an acritical way, which is very much presenting it as a de facto sort of economic revolutionary force. There's very sort of little criticism in the mainstream sort of kind of publications regarding the technology. That's not to say there's not a lot of criticism sort of existing in in the academy, but certainly in other areas as well, as to really what the impact of this technology is. This is certainly my interest in it. This is the role that I'm trying to bring, as I mentioned earlier, to the all-party parliamentary group at Westminster, where the room is very much filled with private interests, with entrepreneurs who are there to present their case in, quite frankly, a very evangelical, a very kind of beatific sort of kind of ideal of what blockchain is and what it can do, that I find sort of highly problematic in many ways. So this idea that it's all about the blockchain, this sort of totalizing, kind of globalizing sort of ideal is fascinating, and in many ways goes back to the comment I made in our discussion earlier, in relation to the way that particular idea sort of maps on top of the fourth industrial revolution as something which is almost beyond comprehension, something, this idea that's almost becomes sort of beyond human imagining what this could entail. And quite frankly, the way that in itself follows a lineage from kind of various sort of ideological forms, whether that be kind of various forms of religion, going back to a kind of a pre-capitalist position through to the development of capitalism. This is another grand narrative. It's another sort of big idea which has very powerful social and cultural effects. Quite what the role that blockchain will be playing within even the fourth industrial revolution as an idea, is still very much evolving. One of the key sort of criticisms, one of the key sort of mainstream criticisms in many ways, actually, that have come to light in the last couple of years since the ideas of what blockchain can do have got past mere cryptocurrency, has been this fascination with, well, actually, what is it good for? Really, what does it do that existing forms of network technology, whether that's sort of other forms of cloud computing or databases, other forms of networking that presently exist and relate to the internet and to the web more generally, what is it doing that these can't already do? So there's some, and this is even filtered through now really to the way that certain legal firms, so we're talking about sort of magic circle, very large city legal firms here who are working closely with entrepreneurs and startups, but also increasingly with major consortia, which include major financial institutions, insurance companies, and so on and so forth, all of whom, we must remember, the technology was first developed in its Bitcoin phase by, when it was first proposed by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2008 off the back of the financial crisis, as a technology precisely to circumvent the authority and the central mediating force of large global sort of corporations and banks. So we have come round to an interesting paradox and irony about what the technology is doing here, that it has been very much sort of developed and has been absorbed into existing processes and systems, which in many ways kind of further sort of problematize really what the technology is sort of good for. There are sort of any number of kind of alternative philosophical and political arguments we can throw at this. Don't really have time to kind of go too far down that road today. What I have seen written, for example, about taking the kind of the libertarian anarchic qualities that the technology was first developed for in relation to Bitcoin. So that idea of undermining the middleman, getting away from central banks and forms of central authority. So high libertarian ideals of absolute liberty that the technology was able to facilitate have been, if you like, re-energized by socialist and kind of left-wing narratives. But they're not really, I've been very interested in a number of these sort of interventions in our discussions today about the practicality of these things. So we've had a number of questions. We are dealing with kind of some utopian idealism in relation to really what the technology can do. And that, at this moment in time, the sort of the socialist values are very much trying to play back on the anarchic qualities that were first devised for the disintermediating aspects of the technology, which anyone who sort of aware of the kind of the finer detail of socialist sort of ideologies will realize that decentralizing notion is slightly problematic in many regards. So these are the kind of just some of the perspectives, to go back to the sort of the title of what I'm talking about today, that I wanted to throw at you. And I'm not going to linger on them for too long because I really want to have a discussion with you. I mean, I've been locked away in a room now for nearly 5 months writing a book on this, quite intensely, and it's nice to be out. I've sort of... so it would be great to kind of really to shove this back onto you and actually see what your thoughts are on this, and then you can buy the book in a few months' time and find out whether they land in there. Credit will be given. So obviously the economic argument, I've already spoken about this. The economic argument is the foundational argument of where blockchain comes from. It is, I argue, fundamentally a capitalist technology. It is there to facilitate modes of capitalism, which have more recently kind of turned to arguably the sort of what Byung-Chul Han sort of refers to as the mutant form of capitalism, which some of us may recognize as neoliberalism. That has spawned the desire for greater levels of competition and greater levels of market intervention in how blockchain is used and what it can facilitate. Those are the sort of the core economic sort of functions. And yes, they do relate to cryptocurrency. And again, a number of us will be aware of the contradictions which are flowing around the sort of the cryptocurrency world at the moment in terms of the absurd sort of price of Bitcoin versus its legitimacy really as a mode of a transaction of value. I mean, it's yes, it can an individual Bitcoin can be realized in what are called satoshis, which are very small sort of incremental features which can be spent in a more realistic fashion. But sort of the idea that you're going to go in and sort of with whatever today's kind of price of a Bitcoin is and use that in any sort of realistic way really fundamentally upsets the idea of it functioning as a legitimate form of currency. There are a number of legal arguments which also tie into this into relation to actually what Bitcoin is from an economic or legal economic perspective, whether it is a currency, whether it's property. The fundamental basis at the moment, I would suggest, or the kind of the evolving global acceptance of what it is it's a form of intangible property. But this works in an interesting way because actually what that does is that opens up all the other possibilities of what blockchain can do and what tokenization can do. So if we take Bitcoin and forget about it as a currency and imagine it as a way to actually transmit, to store, to make available for transaction other forms of information, other forms of intangible property such as bonds and share certificates and other forms like that, then we can already see how that sort of post-cryptocurrency narrative of intangible property becomes a very attractive one from an economic point of view. Cultural production. I'm going to ignore all the arguments about how blockchain is going to make artists and musicians so much better off. That's kind of an obvious idea of the cultural production that blockchain can help produce. I'll leave you to go and have a look at those and make up your own mind about them. My take on cultural production in this particular context is precisely what I said at the beginning. I see the technology as something which is producing a very particular culture. It's having very particular cultural effects. And even the very notion of the blockchain ecosystem as some sort of coherent form, although of course it never is, it's chaos, as a number of people have referred to it. But this idea that there is some kind of cultural production which is occurring, I suggest is occurring at the level of this ecosystem. It's producing forms of knowledge, it's producing forms of skill, and other certain sort of epistemological and sort of different ideologies are all being produced, and these are having cultural effects. So that's what I mean by cultural production in relation to blockchain. And in that sense, that sort of gets to the heart of why I find why this technology, as far as I'm concerned, can't be ignored, sort of in the way that others have said it. The fact that it's not all about blockchain, but it's important, for me at least, to take seriously that other people, and certainly other influential people, think that it's all about the blockchain. So we're getting into these sort of meta-analyses here. But nonetheless, that's where I see it as important. I'm not going to, if you like, be suckered by the first narrative. I'm going to look beyond that to see why they're saying that and what context it's being produced in. That blockchain ecosystem, therefore, is incredibly political, which takes us to the next stage. So the political in this context, yes, it's about government, it's about state-led notions of regulation, or the potential for them. But really here what I'm talking about is kind of politics, not party politics. I'm talking about the political in the sort of kind of critical theory, sort of the way that we kind of use that term, to simply kind of think about the way that the technology is facilitating forms of interrelatedness or damaging others. So it's undermining certain stages of political interrelatedness, and it's creating others. It's having a reshaping effect and a translating effect, not a disrupting effect. I don't agree that it's having a disrupting effect, but nonetheless, it is doing something, and it's telling us something. And for me, it's telling us, so really this is more about, I guess, very much what Marx would have spoken about in terms of political economy. So I'm interested in this in relation to the political economy arguments here. So the idea that the blockchain ecosystem, the way that it's spoken about, the way that the technology is being conceptualized, is having profound effects on the way that politics is going to work in the future, or could work in the future. And it's going to have political economic effects in the sense that we are seeing a retreat from the political and very much beating a very loud drum for the economic. So, I've already mentioned neoliberalism. Again, haven't really got time to go into any sort of deep dive definitions about neoliberalism here. I guess some of you will already be fairly au fait with the notion. Charles, in his presentation earlier, again, sort of mentioned Foucault, and the idea of governmentality is another important element of this for me, because we take a use case. So let's take a very practical use case which is in development at the moment, and that relates to the, there's two things, two interrelated points. So there's the creation of greater levels of data sovereignty. So we are, all of us individually, huge creators of data. We already know this. We've seen this very much in what's been going on in the news recently, and the influence of Facebook and the problems that poor Mark Zuckerberg has had in trying to sort of justify how that data is being used. I don't really worry about him that much. So the point being that data sovereignty will allow things like health records to be better managed by each of us as individuals. We will use the technology to push this thing to the web, to the internet, rather than have it pulled from us. This notion of data sovereignty is a highly political theme because it talks to Foucault's notion of governmentality. We can therefore refer to it perhaps as blockchain governmentality because it has a direct effect on how we work as sovereign agents, and really how our data is used, or how we are expected to have a form of self-care around our own data. So there's a lot on the political go. I could talk about that all day. That's really what the book is about. The regulatory conundrum. Now, again, this relates to a couple of points that I think I made earlier around regulatory technologies. So for me, the regulatory conundrum is therefore twofold. On the one hand, we have blockchain as a thing to be regulated. Do we need to regulate it, and for what reason? We're seeing this a lot now. Again, it was the first major use case. We're seeing a lot of discussion coming through of how to regulate cryptocurrency, or perhaps just ban it. There's a real sledgehammer sort of approach going on in many nations around the trading and the free flow of cryptocurrencies. It's much easier maybe just to cut it off, and we won't have to worry about it anymore. What's quite behind, what sort of political and economic arguments lie behind that, I will leave for you to think about. The defense of fiat currency, for example, and really what that means. So blockchain to be regulated, but blockchain also is a regulator. Now, again, this is the more interesting side of the story. Again, it's a highly political one. I'm writing quite a lot, and always sort of have done, in relation to the way that blockchain could be used. Blockchain is fundamentally a ledger, right? So it's a database that's shared simultaneously amongst a series of different nodes. So if each of these tables in this room were a node, you would all have a copy of the ledger that was updated in real time simultaneously. It becomes, therefore, a highly auditable mechanism. again, none of these things are straightforward. You take someone like Michael Power's arguments from the late 90s about the development of an audit culture, the audit explosion. We are again feeding into what I suggest are sort of elements of governmentality here around self-auditing, or just the sort of general gathering of pace of an audit culture, which Michael Power sort of suggested began sort of around the transition of Margaret Thatcher's government through to New Labour. So the auditability function, however, can be mobilized as a useful regulatory tool, blockchain as regulator, if we think about this in terms of beneficial ownership registers. So this is where I'm particularly interested. My background in law is in equity and trust law. I know I don't look like it. No one would hire me as a trust lawyer, but I've been well cited in offshore jurisdictions, which has been an interesting one because I never intended to do that. I initially wrote a paper which looked at the function of blockchain as a way of developing a trustee architecture. So for the purposes of developing and the way that it might impact various sort of fiduciary obligations. So that was my kind of point of entry of this, but it also, and it kind of got picked up perversely in my mind by a number of offshore jurisdictions who were like, oh yeah, maybe we can use the technology to do this. And I never wanted you to do it like that. My whole point of writing that paper was to show regulators more generally what could be done with this technology and therefore how it could be used to create a deeper field of obfuscation rather than that transparency that everyone is so excited about, such as Margaret Hodge just in the news yesterday, and trying to pin down the problem of dirty money in the Cayman Islands and so on and so forth. So nonetheless, if we're looking for a practical purpose for this, and truthfully I find this as a useful link to notions of socialist value as well, get into the notion of communism if we want to go that far as well, but the sort of, as you know, the idea of the ultimate crowdsourcing of funds is state tax, then actually we need to preserve tax in that way. And technology is used to do that more, I'm not going to use efficiently. See how easily you fall into kind of the language and the vocabulary that's used around certain regulatory ideals. Effectively is what I'm looking for there. Efficiently, sort of value for money, efficiency, these are all pertinent regulatory terms, yes, but they are all so loaded politically, it's not true. So, you know, really at the end of the day, this is all about language. This is the way that language is used. So that's a quick overview of the regulatory conundrum. Ideology, therefore, I think it's pretty clear that I've demonstrated it sort of across all of these levels the role that ideology is playing. So I will just finish up here now by sort of saying that, yes, there are innumerable isms which surround the blockchain. It started as a libertarian ideal, so one that would sort of free economic citizens to explore their full economic potential away from any form of government regulation. So that was the libertarianism which sort of birthed Bitcoin. Since then, we have seen an encroachment upon the capital, you know, from capitalism to sort of suck up and attenuate some of the harsher edges of that libertarianism by saying, actually, big banks and insurance companies, we're actually quite using, this might be good for us because we can use it in our back office systems to make them more efficient, and that will actually drive better sort of profit margins downstream, if you like. And then, since then, as I've already said, I kind of recognize a much deeper encroachment of neoliberalism in the terms that we are seeing around health records and other forms of development of notions of data sovereignty, which could apply to any number of different areas. So, for example, they sort of spoke about on the video earlier, Walmart using the technology to essentially prove provenance of chicken. And on the other end of the scale, those diamond earrings, which are important as her anniversary present, and make sure that they haven't come, they're not blood diamonds. Provenance is a very key point here, and it's not an idea which is neutral in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. It's very ideological. Quite what ideology is playing through the notion of provenance right now could be anyone's guess. It works across sort of many different forms, I would argue. But nonetheless, it is very much there for all to see. What other isms we might want to come to, again, I will maybe leave that for discussion. So give us time for questions, and I know I've sort of rambled on a bit. I will put it back over to you, so thank you very much.